going to be talking about Unit 4 in the course MGPE 014, and the topic that I'm going to be talking about is the Gandhian Approach to Development. My name is Dr. Shubhangi Vaidya and I teach in the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, IGNOU. Let's look at the aims and objectives of the lecture. Today basically we are going to interrogate the shortcomings of our dominant ways of life by discussing the alternative developmental path proposed by Gandhi. We will also reflect upon its relevance in the contemporary times. Let's start by talking about Gandhi's approach. Gandhian approach to development basically was rooted in the notions of harmony and balance. So to quote Gandhi, "The world will live in peace only when the individuals composing it make up their minds to do so." In other words, the individual should attain a state when mind, body, and speech are in proper coordination. The most important factor on which human destiny depends is human quality. Not just the quality of certain elites, but the average quality of the billions of inhabitants of the planet. And to achieve balance, responsibility, and harmony, the Gandhian perspective is that we need to look inwards at our inner qualities rather than outwards. So to sum up, the Gandhian approach towards development speaks of development in a holistic manner, which begins with the individual, which looks at individual self-realization and which focuses upon how individuals can live in harmony and in a state of peace and in a state of responsibility with all other living creatures on the planet, and world peace being at the very core of this idea. So let's look at some of the important elements of Gandhi's notion of development. So his notion of development was basically emphasizing the establishment of a non-exploitative economy. The Gandhian approach to development is through the avenue of truth and non-violence. Its goal is not just pure material benefit, but the advancement of humanity by strengthening the character and the individual development of personality. So one of the very, very important ideas that this way of looking at development foregrounds is that no one's gain should be anyone's loss, either financial, physical, moral, or spiritual. So you see, when we learn economics, the very idea of economics is founded on the notion of the economic man, or the individual as an actor that strives to maximize his or her benefit or profit. Now, this notion basically looks at individual profit, individual benefit, without really considering the social or the communitarian aspect. So Gandhi's notion is that nobody in the path of development, nobody should suffer. Development should be something that would benefit or that would be of use, that would be of value to everybody. It should not be at the cost of anybody. Now the problem is, how do we develop in a manner that is compatible with non-violence? As we have been discussing in the previous talks as well, if we look at the way in which the developmental pattern of the West has unfolded and has been adopted by many countries all over the world, we see that this developmental path is based upon exploitation of natural and human resources. And when we exploit our resources, this is a fundamentally violent path. And if we look at the contemporary crisis of the modern world, we see the crisis of the modern world playing out in three dimensions: the crisis of resource exhaustion, the ecological crisis, and the crisis of alienation and disorientation of human beings. So we all know that we are consuming far more than the earth can provide us. We are depleting our resources, whether it is natural resources like forests, we are making land infertile, We are using our mineral wealth in a most unsustainable manner. We are using our water resources. We all know about the crisis of the water table that is being faced by many countries today. So the way in which we are depleting and exhausting our resources is basically indicative of an economic system or of a developmental path that is fundamentally exploitative and violent in nature. And the ecological crisis about which we are all familiar, we see that today climate change is one of the major crises that is confronting the world. And this ecological crisis, the crisis of pollution, the crisis of mounting piles of garbage which are non-biodegradable, we are seeing so many species being exterminated or dying out because of the pollution that the world is seeing. And of course, the most crucial from the human perspective is the way that we as human beings are also alienated from our natural world, alienated from our social networks and relationships, alienated in a sense from our very beings. So these fundamental crises of the modern world all reflect a violent and exploitative path towards growth and development. Gandhiism also is rooted in a very powerful critique of materialism. When development emphasizes mainly economic growth, it implies a purely materialistic view of life. And the kind of developmental path that we are on is inseparable from this view of life. We also see that this kind of economic path does not resonate or really does not address the needs and the experiences of those who are outside its scope. The poorest, those who are hungry, those who are marginalized. We find that this pattern of development tends to exclude large swathes of people. And the models of development that are being placed as being the ultimate models, as being the most effective models, these are models which really exclude and have no space for those who are the poorest of the poor. What is the foundation of Gandhi's non-violent order? Swadeshi is a very, very important component, and we'll talk about it a little more now. To quote Gandhi, it has been urged that India cannot adopt Swadeshi in the economic life. Those who advance this objection do not look upon Swadeshi as a rule of life. With them, it is more a patriotic effort, not to be made if involved any self-denial. Swadeshi, as defined here, is a religious principle to be undergone in utter disregard of physical discomfort caused to individuals. Much of the deep poverty of India is due to the departure from Swadeshi in the economic life. If not a single article of commerce had been brought from outside India, she would today be a land flowing with milk and honey, unquote. So to simplify what Gandhi meant, according to Gandhi, Swadeshi is not just a slogan. Swadeshi is not just something that is said, to show one's patriotism. Swadeshi has a very, very profound significance in that it is something which is looking at the needs, or which is looking at the way of redressing or addressing the poverty of India, of the poorest and the most humblest Indian. And this may require a sacrifice from all of us. This may require us to forego many of our comforts. In order to forego our comforts, we have to be genuinely committed. We have to have a genuine commitment to the notion of Swadeshi to ensure that the poorest, the most marginalized person has a means of looking after themselves, of having a livelihood, of having those basic resources necessary for a quality of life. And what, according to Gandhi, is the ideal economy? Once again, to quote him, according to me, the economic constitution of India, and for the matter of that, the world, should be such that no one under it should suffer from the want of food and clothing. In other words, everybody should be able to get sufficient work to enable him to make the two ends meet. And this ideal can be universally realized only if the means of production of the elementary necessaries of life remain in the control of masses. These should be freely available to all, as God's air and water are or ought to be. They should not be made a vehicle of traffic for the exploitation of others." Unquote. In other words, self-reliance, the ability of the most humble, the most poor, to be able to have an element of control over the means of production which will enable him or her to eke out an existence. So basically, the entire Gandhian notion of development is very, very powerfully based in this notion of self-reliance of the masses. That the most ordinary, the most vulnerable citizen should not be in a situation where he or she cannot access the basic necessities of life. He or she should have access to those resources which will enable him or her to be able to gain a livelihood and be able to satisfy their basic needs. So, the notion of sufficient work to be available to all so that nobody suffers from the basic wants of food, clothing and shelter. This may seem like a very simple notion. However, the way we think about our world today, when we look around at what is happening around us, when we see the vast inequalities in our world, when we find that the basic resources or the basic needs of food, clothing and shelter are not available even now after so many years of independence to so many of our citizens, this is something that should really give us pause and make us to think about what kind of economic path that we have pursued and what are the correctives that need to be put in place so that every Indian across the board can access work and be able to fulfill the basic needs of himself or herself and the family. Decentralization is also an extremely important tenet in Gandhi's overall vision of development. Under conditions of centralized production, and history tells us that, contemporary history tells us that, we see that economic power tends to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. One of the major critiques of the developmental path that many countries have embarked upon in the post-colonial period is that this pattern of development has resulted in enormous inequalities. There have been monopolistic tendencies, there has been immense concentration of income and wealth in a few hands to the detriment of the larger mass of population. So this intensification of inequalities and the huge and ever-growing gulf between the rich and the poor also results in conflict between labor and capital. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is something that is certainly not a good sign or certainly not a good condition for social peace and harmony. And what is the alternative vision for this? The alternative vision is decentralized methods of production, primarily for social justice, so that producers can control their means of production and enjoy the benefits that accrue. So the means of production should not be concentrated in a few hands, such that only a few profit to the benefit or to the detriment of the many, but a worker should have in his or her hands the means to eke out a livelihood, the means to produce and to enjoy the benefits of that production. Decentralization and economic generation is also a very, very important aspect of the Gandhian scheme of development. Now, as you all know, Gandhi placed a great deal of emphasis, or the entire Gandhian approach towards development and towards the economy is based upon promotion of small-scale and cottage industries. The premise behind this is that large-scale mechanized industries cannot provide the additional employment that is needed to satisfy the demand for productive work by millions of Indians. there is simply no way that the factory system or a factory system model of development can provide adequate employments to the teeming millions, many of whom reside in our rural hinterland. And of course, the pattern of our economic organization, therefore, must be rethought, particularly in the matter of the production of consumer goods, which the people in the countryside did in the past and can even now produce to meet their own requirements. So the basic consumer goods that people need can very easily be locally produced. You don't need a massive factory infrastructure for producing the basic consumer items. This, in fact, is something that can be done at the local level, provided a suitable roadmap is provided reorganization of the rural economy is undertaken in a big way, so that the rural economy can cater to its needs and become self-sufficient. What are the benefits of small-scale industries that this program or this idea of decentralization entails? The availability of raw materials, tools and implements, skills and markets are all factors that have to be taken into account. The raw material needed for essential consumer goods are ordinarily available in the rural areas. Secondly, the tools and the implements are already there for such production, or they used to be there in the past. And if they are not there, these tools and implements, which are fairly simple in nature, they are fairly labor intensive in nature, they can very easily be manufactured locally by skilled carpenters and blacksmiths. And this is further going to provide an impetus to rural employment and for the plying of the traditional trades that many individuals have been trained in. The skills can be imparted easily and the work can be carried on easily within the home. So we see that the benefit of small-scale industries is that the most poor, the most marginalized individual can very easily learn these skills, can very easily utilize these skills and use them for livelihood generation. Now, in practice, how can decentralization be operationalized? Now, for an increase in production and provision of additional employment in the traditional and rural industries and crafts, reorganization is required. And this reorganization basically connotes efforts for securing raw materials, supplying tools and implements, providing credit and marketing. The unit of operation may not necessarily continue to be just the individual or the family as it used to be in the traditional system or in the past. New methods of organization and association can be thought of, wherein numbers of families may group themselves together on a trusteeship basis, or the trust, according to the needs of the situation, may be either a village multi-purpose agency or an institution for a specialized craft. So there can be a combination of tradition and modernity, new forms of associations, new forms of getting together, new forms of coming together for basically carrying out small-scale and cottage industries. However, making this entire process better organized, more productive, and gearing it towards addressing or towards dealing with the problems of unemployment, the problems of underemployment. So this is a very, very important vision, a very, very important roadmap, a very, very important alternative strategy for development, as opposed to the highly capital intensive or the highly mechanized or factory-based model of development. So the Gandhian alternative basically stresses on local, on self-reliance, on people mobilizing in order to ply their trades, to cater to the rural economy, and basically to achieve self-sufficiency. Another very, very important plank of the Gandhian scheme of development was the whole notion of integrated rural development. Now, you would have seen or you would have heard and read extensively about Gandhi's immense emphasis on rural India as, in a sense, being the real India, and how in order to build India, you have to work not from the top down, but from the bottom upwards. You have to start with the poorest, you have to start with the most marginalized, you have to start with the most vulnerable. So development can only begin when you address the needs of the poorest and the weakest sections of society. And in this scheme of things, the centrality of the village was always emphasized by Gandhi. In fact, it pained him deeply to see the disintegration and the ruin of villages and the village economy. Gandhi believed very firmly that a strong, economically sound rural economy would revitalize the Indian economy as a whole. And a gospel of rural mindedness was what Gandhi preached. He encouraged people to think like a villager, to think like a rural minded person, basically to place the village, to place the rural economy at the very forefront of their ideas. So in order to be able to respect the labor that was done by the rural artisan, one had to put themselves, in a sense, into their shoes and think rural, think like them. So Gandhi said that you have therefore to be rural minded before you can be non-violent. And to be rural minded, you have to have faith in the spinning wheel. So as we all know, the spinning wheel, or the charkha, in a sense was emblematic, was a major emblem, was a major symbol of Gandhi's belief in the importance of using one's hands, of doing one's own work, of labor-intensive crafts, of skills that individuals could do towards promoting self-sufficiency, not of just themselves, but also of the community as a whole. Back to the villages, this was a very, very important clarion call that was given by Gandhi. He gave a call to everybody to go and work in the villages. You all know that Gandhi believed that India lives in her villages, and until and unless you know and understand rural India, you will never really be able to touch or approach the heart and soul of India. And for this, the development of the rural economy, rural industry and rural skills was very, very critical. In small self-sufficient villages, producing mostly for their own consumption, a peaceful life devoted to the pursuit of democratic values was possible, according to Gandhi. So according to Gandhi, the non-violent methods of production that he advocated were only possible in a small rural setting. Big urban concentrations, however, inevitably result in monopolization and accumulation of wealth by a minority. And therefore, economic concentration is bound to lead also to political centralization. And centralization, as we have discussed earlier, is a way of developing that is basically supportive of violence, because it is based upon appropriation, it is based upon concentration of wealth, of power in few hands. It is something that disenfranchises the ordinary individual. It takes away power at the local level in order to concentrate it in a central or a decision-making body, which really does not take on board the voices of the millions. And Gandhi held that non-violence could be realized not on the basis of a factory civilization, but only on that of self-contained villages. Having understood the fundamentals of the Gandhian notion of development, let's look at some of its important critiques. Jawaharlal Nehru said, and I quote, "The whole question is how to achieve this non-violent society and what its contents should be. I do not understand why a village should necessarily embody truth and non-violence. A village, normally speaking, is backward intellectually and culturally, and no progress can be made from a backward environment." Unquote. So Gandhi has often been criticized for idealizing the notion of the village. The ideal rural utopia that he speaks about, does it really exist? Or is it that even within the village, you find the same kinds of problems, the problems of structural poverty, inequality, and so on and so forth, that are to be seen all over the country? Now, while Gandhi accepted that villages were far from ideal, he nonetheless placed a great deal of faith in rural transformation. He firmly believed that the only way that India could develop was by focusing on its villages. However, as we all know, independent India embarked upon a path of development which was very different from the Gandhian ideal. This was a path of development based upon industrialization, centralized planning, in other words, the whole notion of industrialize or perish. Of course, there is an entire backdrop and an entire background to this path of development. We see that India desperately needed a takeoff from a country that was mired in poverty, that was mired in unemployment. There was a need to make India rise to the next level and to have a self-sustaining economy. And many of the economic decisions or the pathways that were adopted at that time, in a sense, were in direct contradiction to the Gandhian ideals of development. Let us sum up what we have discussed so far. We find that the Gandhian alternative strategy of development was premised upon non-violence, non-exploitative economy, self-sufficiency and self-reliance, decentralization, and rejection of a large-scale centralized industry-driven growth. While Gandhi may certainly be critiqued for painting the Indian village as some sort of a utopia and rejecting the technology-driven consumeristic pattern of life, we find that his relevance in the contemporary scenario is very, very great. That if we look at the stark realities around us, we find that Gandhi is becoming even more relevant in the 21st century than he was at any other point of time. We find that in a situation of environmental degradation, climate change, global pandemic, massive losses of jobs that have resulted as a consequence of many contemporary developments, immiseration of the labor force, unsustainable migration, and as we are seeing in our world today, the threat and the terror of a global pandemic, we find that Gandhian alternatives most certainly need a relook and a reappreciation. Thank you.